Hi everyone, I'm Nadia, and in today's video, my mom is making a gorgeous set of rose geode resin coasters. After mixing her part A and part B resin for about 3 minutes, she separates the resin into 2 cups, one for clear resin and one to add the pigments. As you guys can see, she has some real rose petals set aside, and she's going to be mixing colors until she matches the color of the rose petals. The first pigments she's going to be mixing is Resin Pro's Color Fun Deluxe in the shade Violet and Oxide Red. She'll also be using Color Fun's White to lighten up the colors. She starts with a few drops of the Oxide Red and then follows it with a few drops of Violet and mixes the two together. They're a bit darker than the rose petals, so she adds some white. Then she brings in a fourth color, and this is a pigment paste from Just Resin in the shade Hot Pink. She adds a little bit onto a wooden stick and mixes it together. She continues to mix colors until she achieves the same color as the rose petals. If you don't have the exact pigments or colors that you want to work with, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy new pigments. You can mix the pigments that you already have to achieve those colors. And this will certainly save you a few bucks. She uses the paper towel that the rose petals are on to compare the colors, and I think we have a winner. Then she's carefully adding some gold flakes into a small cup, and she's doing so with a wooden stick because these gold flakes can be extremely sticky. Then she mixes it together with resin and sets it aside to use later. She starts pouring her rose pigmented resin onto opposite sides of the molds. She leaves an empty space in the middle where she's going to be adding the rose petals. If you're pouring resin into your molds and you don't want the resin to spread so much, it's a good idea to wait around 10 to 30 minutes after mixing your resin so that it thickens. The thicker your resin is, the less it'll spread across the mold. Although you also want to pay attention to the amount of pigmented resin that you're adding, because although my mom waited for the resin to thicken, it still ends up bleeding into the middle, as you'll be able to see throughout this video. And she was aiming for the center to remain clear. For any unwanted drops on the molds, she's cleaning them up using an alcohol wipe. Then she takes the clear cup of resin and pours it directly down the middle of the molds. Now she's taking the white pigmented resin and drizzles it over the rose pigmented resin. She does this carefully with a wooden stick to be able to control the amount of white pigmented resin she puts. Then she uses a heat gun to help blend the white pigmented resin and the rose pigmented resin together, and continues doing so with the wooden stick, while also using the wooden stick to drag some of the rose pigmented resin into the center. Now she takes the rose petals and places them into the clear center of the molds. Then she takes the gold flakes and with the wooden stick places them onto the rose petals and the surrounding areas. Here you can really tell how much the rose pigmented resin has started to shift towards the center. Now she's pouring some clear resin on the parchment paper to mix with some gold metallic powder. She's also adding just a drop of bronze metallic powder. Then she mixes the metallic powders and the resin together, and with a wooden stick starts to apply it onto the molds. At this point, although what we think has been plenty of time, the resin hasn't started to cure yet, so when my mom places the metallic powder mixed with resin into the molds, it doesn't stay still because the resin inside of the molds is still moving. Similar what happened with the rose pigmented resin, throughout time it shifts and changes, and this also happens with the gold metallic powder. Here she's adding some clear resin down the center of the molds, which opens up that middle space and causes the rose pigmented resin to shift backwards. Then she continues to add the gold metallic powder mixed with resin into the molds. And now that we know that throughout time this gold metallic powder shifts because the resin is still moving, the best thing to do would have been to wait around 2 hours so that the resin has started to cure and is a little bit sticky. At this point, anything that you add into the molds will stay put. We use a similar technique when working with glitter and resin, so that the glitter doesn't sink to the bottom. After pouring our first layer of resin, we wait around 2 hours and then add our glitter, that way it stays in place. She continues to add some clear resin into the center and attempts to open up the area where the rose petals are. While applying the gold metallic powder, she splattered some accidentally into one of the molds and ended up liking the effect that it gave, so she did that to the rest. And here's a clip of my mom demolding the coasters. They aren't exactly the effect that she was going for, but when working with resin, sometimes things don't go as planned. And I think that they came out beautifully. She added a heat-resistant top coat and a gold trim, and here's the final product. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to see more like this in the future. Follow me on Instagram, Summer Girl Designs, and my mom's Instagram, Wild Heart Resin Art.